They said she was a fool. They said the mountains would eat her alive, that the snow would be her shroud, and the wind would sing her a lonesome dirge. They said a widow alone was just a statistic waiting for the first blizzard. The town's men offered her a ride to the valley, a room in the boarding house, a sensible life. But grief is not sensible. It's a raw, jagged thing that doesn't care about winter or practicality or the right choice. She looked at the whispering pines and saw a covenant. They saw a death sentence. That first snowflake, the one that landed on the pump handle and didn't melt, was the beginning of something none of them, least of all me, could have predicted. This isn't a story about survival. It's a story about what happens when a person decides that staying is the only way to truly live, even if it means fighting the very soul of the earth to do it. The air had that particular bite to it, the one that comes right before the world decides to turn white and unforgiving. It was the last day of October, and I was riding the fence line, checking for breaks before the deep cold set in. My hands were numb even through the leather gloves, and my horse, a gray gelding named Dusty, was blowing plumes of steam that hung in the air like ghosts. That's when I saw her, a dark speck against the brown and gold of the aspens, stubbornly holding onto their leaves as if they too were refusing to let go. I knew who it was. Everyone in Jackson Hole knew who she was, Clara Hadley. Her husband, Samuel, had been a good man, a quiet man who worked a small homestead up against the base of the sleeping Indian. He'd been found last spring not far from his cabin, his neck twisted at a sickening angle, his horse standing nearby, guilt and confusion in its big, dark eyes. A simple accident, the coroner said. A fall from a spooked horse. But for Clara, it was the end of one world and the beginning of a siege on another. I rode up slowly, not wanting to startle her. She was standing in her garden, a patch of earth that had been turned over and was now bare, except for a few withered stalks of corn that stood like sentinels. She wasn't wearing a coat, just a worn wool shawl over a faded dress. Her hands, covered in dirt, were resting on the handle of a rake. She looked small, broken, and yet there was a stillness in her posture that wasn't resignation. It was a decision. "Mornin', Mrs. Hadley," I said, tipping my hat. The formal address felt right, a barrier against the intimacy of her grief. She turned slowly, her face pale, with dark circles under her eyes that seemed to have taken root. Her hair, a wiry, stubborn gray, was escaping its bun in wild wisps. "Mr. Granger," she said, her voice a thin, reedy thing. It was surprising she even spoke, she was so hollowed out. The silence for a moment was filled with the rustle of dry leaves and the distant cry of a hawk. It was then I noticed the stack of wooden boards beside the cabin, a pile of white paint cans, and a new, heavy-looking scythe. She wasn't just grieving, she was preparing. "Heard you were staying," I said, a statement, not a question. The whole town was abuzz with it. "Walt Peterson said he offered you a room in town. Good man, Walt." She met my eyes, and for a second I saw a flash of the woman she must have been before the accident. Fierce, independent. "Walt is a good man," she agreed. "But this is my home." She gestured to the cabin, to the garden, to the mountains themselves. "Samuel put his life into this place, into the earth. I ain't gonna let it go because the days get short and the wind turns cold." I shifted in my saddle, a nervous habit. "Clara," I started, using her first name for the first time, "you don't understand what you're up against. The pass will be closed by Thanksgiving. You'll be cut off. The snow comes up to the roof in a bad winter. The game goes deep into the high country. You can't chop enough wood, you can't hunt enough, you can't survive. Not alone." It wasn't just the cold, it was the isolation. It was the silence so profound it was like a physical weight on your chest. It was the cabin fever that could make a man see things, hear things in the howling wind. The apsh, as we called the old mountain madness. She was a widow, a woman past her prime, and she was talking about facing it alone. It was a fool's errand, and in my experience, fools often ended up frozen stiff, found in the spring with a peaceful look on their faces and a story that would never be told. A flicker of defiance lit in her eyes. "I know what the mountains can do, Mr. Granger. I have lived in their shadow for 20 years. I know the wind can talk and the cold can bite right through to your marrow. I know the loneliness can sing a song that'll drive you to madness. But I also know that Samuel kept a journal. Every spring he'd write down the things he saw, the patterns of the storms, which trees held the most strength, where the deer would yard up. I got that journal." She tapped her temple. "And I got his memory right here. That's my winter store." I wanted to argue, to tell her she was being sentimental, and that a journal wouldn't keep her warm. But there was a set to her jaw I recognized. It was the same stubbornness my own father had when he was set on a foolish course. You could argue logic until you were blue in the face, But you were just wasting breath. At least let me help you get that woodpile stacked proper, I offered, getting down from Dusty. It was a small concession, a way to be part of her decision without fully endorsing it. The truth was, a part of me admired her. In a world of men who preached grit and self-reliance, here was a woman who was actually about to live it, or die trying. The first few hours of work were silent. She directed me with a quiet efficiency, pointing to where she wanted the logs, her thin arms managing to haul pieces that would have winded a younger man. I noticed her hands. They weren't the soft hands of a woman who spent her days in the kitchen. They were calloused, the knuckles swollen with age and work. Her fingers had a permanent grime under the nails, the kind that comes from planting and digging and making a life from the dirt. She was no stranger to struggle. This was just the next battle. "He used to whistle," she said, finally breaking the silence. She was holding a small, carved bird, a chickadee that she'd found in a pocket of one of Samuel's old coats. She was turning it over in her fingers, a strange, tender look on her face. "He could whistle any tune, put a melody to the sound of rain on the roof. It drove me crazy when we were courting. He'd whistle all the time, but after a while I missed it when he didn't." She put the bird on the windowsill next to a dried sprig of sage. It was a shrine, this place. A museum to a life that was supposed to be lived out together. It was heartbreaking, and I began to understand that her staying wasn't about practicality or even survival in the way I understood it. It was about fidelity, a promise that even though Samuel was gone, the life they built together wasn't. It was about proving that he wasn't just a memory, but a foundation. "What's your plan for meat?" I asked, trying to pull my mind away from the encroaching sadness I felt for her. "I got a couple of deer I could spare." "No," she said, shaking her head. "No handouts, Mr. Granger, I'll make do." She nodded toward her new scythe. "I have that. Samuel always said the fields on the other side of the creek had a good population of rabbits, and I have a few chickens. They'll sleep in the kitchen if they have to." She had a plan for everything, a contingency for every failure. It was either the most impressive organizational skill I'd ever seen or the most elaborate delusion. As the afternoon sun began to dip behind the mountain, casting long, purple shadows across the valley, she offered me a cup of coffee. I accepted, more to stall than out of thirst. I wanted to understand this. I wanted to see if there was some crack in her resolve I could reason with. But as we sat on her porch, sipping the bitter brew, she seemed more at peace than I'd felt all year. "My father," she began, looking out at the mountains, "he was a man who ran from everything. The war, hard times, responsibility. He always said the smart man knew when to fold M. But my mother, she was different. She stayed. She held the family together when he was gone. She held the land with a grip that could stop a stampede. They buried her in the family plot on the farm. She was 88 years old, her hands still strong, her mind still sharp. She never said she was brave. She just said she was too stubborn to be scared." She took a sip of her coffee and smiled, a faint, genuine smile. "I guess I got her stubbornness." It was a speech, a manifesto. It was the answer I was looking for. It had nothing to do with Samuel's journal or the rabbits or the wood pile. It was about a choice, one that had been made by the women in her bloodline for generations. To stay, to endure. To prove that the world was not stronger than the will of a woman who decided to put her roots down and grow. It was getting late. I had to get back to the ranch to feed my own stock. As I saddled up Dusty, I looked at her one last time. The porch light hadn't been lit. She was conserving the kerosene. She stood in the half-darkness, a solitary figure against the backdrop of a world that was just a few weeks away from trying to kill her. "If you get into trouble," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I wasn't ready to name, "I want you to light a fire on the ridge. The tall one, the one with the dead pine. I'll be able to see it from my place. I'll come." She didn't say thank you. She just nodded, a simple, understanding gesture. I nudged Dusty into a trot and rode away, my mind churning. I could feel the weight of her decision pressing down on me. I had just left a woman to face a harsh winter on a small homestead, entirely alone. It was, by all laws of common sense and decency, a terrible mistake. And yet, as I looked back over my shoulder, I saw her silhouette moving toward the woodpile, starting to stack the last few logs by herself. The image of her, small and indomitable, got stuck in my mind. The first snow came 2 weeks later. It wasn't a whisper, it was a shout. It fell for 3 days straight, blanketing the valley in a relentless white. From my ranch, I could see the pass was closed, the mountains a blur of white and gray. I hadn't seen a sign of Clara. No smoke from her chimney, no light in her window. The thought sat in my stomach like a stone. I should have been more forceful, I told myself. I should have made her come with me. I should have physically carried her out of that cabin. The silence from her direction was deafening. I told myself it was just the weather, just the obscuring snow, but at night I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I'd heard her calling out for me, a voice carried on the wind. I was a coward, plain and simple. I let a grieving woman play out her own funeral because I was too respectful of her stubbornness. I fidgeted with my father's pocket watch so much during those weeks that I wore a smooth spot into the metal. I'd even hitched my wagon one morning, determined to go check on her, but I only got 100 yards before the snow was so deep Dusty was floundering. I couldn't even get to her to help. I was a prisoner of my own yard, just as she was a prisoner of her own grief. Then on a night in mid-December, when the cold was so profound, it seemed to crack the very air I saw it. A small pinprick of light dancing on the ridge, the dead pine. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was the signal. She was in trouble. She was dying. The howling wind was a physical force, but I didn't care. I pulled on my heaviest clothes, strapped on my snowshoes, and started the long, arduous trek up to her homestead. I'd brought a pack of supplies, food, medicine, and my shotgun, though I didn't know what I'd be shooting. The wind was a wall I had to push through. The cold burned my lungs with every gasp. I was a fool too, I realized. I was risking my own life for a woman who had practically signed her own death warrant. It took me 4 hours. The cabin, when I finally saw it, looked like a snow-covered mound. There were no lights in the windows. The chimney was a dark, empty void. My heart sank. I was too late. I had left her too long. The guilt was a physical blow, a wrench in my gut that made me double over for a moment. I stumbled to the door, kicking the snow away. It was frozen shut. I had to use the butt of my shotgun to break the ice seal. When I finally pushed it open, the silence inside was not the silence of an empty cabin. It was the silence of a space that was alive and holding its breath. And then I saw her. Clara was sitting in her rocking chair by the cold, dark fireplace, wrapped in a mountain of quilts. She was holding Samuel's carved bird in her hands, her eyes closed. I thought she was dead. The sight of her, so still and pale, stopped my heart. The world seemed to tilt. I had failed. The woman I had left here, the woman whose stubbornness I'd quietly admired, had died because I didn't try hard enough to save her. "Clara," I shouted, rushing to her side, my voice cracking. I reached out to shake her shoulder to do something. Her eyes snapped open. They were clear, bright, and alert. She didn't look like she was dying. She looked like she was waiting. "Mr. Granger," she said, her voice a little hoarse but surprisingly strong. "I'm all out of wood. The snow was so deep it buried the pile. I used the last of it 3 days ago. I figured you'd see the signal eventually. I knew you would." There was no panic in her tone, just a calm, matter-of-fact statement. I stared at her, speechless. My mind was a storm of disbelief and awe. She hadn't died. She'd just been cold. She'd been conserving her energy, wrapping herself in the warmth of her memories and a mountain of handmade quilts, patiently waiting for rescue, trusting that a promise made by a near stranger would be kept. My knees went weak, and I collapsed into a nearby chair, my breath coming in ragged gasps from the exertion and the emotional turmoil. I'd spent the last 3 weeks mourning her, carrying the guilt of her decision as if it were my own. I'd just made a 6-hour trek through a blizzard to find her body and instead found her alive, her faith in me unbroken. I pulled out my father's pocket watch. My hand was trembling. 3 days, I choked out. "You've been sitting here for 3 days without a fire." "I had my blankets," she said, gesturing to the quilts. They were thin and worn, but there were a lot of them. "And I had the memory of Sam's fire to keep me warm." It was a bizarre, almost poetic statement that I didn't fully understand at that moment. It was beyond logic. It was about spirit. I started the fire. The crackle and snap of the wood was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. I looked at her then, truly looked at her. The woman I saw wasn't a victim waiting for her end. She was a warrior patiently holding a line. She was enduring, surviving not out of a death wish but out of a promise. A promise to her dead husband, a promise to her own stubborn spirit, and a promise to herself that she was more than the world's expectations. As the flames began to lick at the wood and the warmth started to fill the small cabin, she made a simple request. "Would you read to me, Mr. Granger? From Samuel's journal. My eyes are tired and I miss hearing his words out loud." I opened the worn, leather-bound book. The handwriting was small and careful, a record of daily life. I began to read about the mundane things, the date he planted the potatoes, the time he saw a fox, the weather patterns. And as I read, I saw her relax, her face softening, the lines of her struggle easing. She was no longer alone. The past had walked in the form of her husband's words, and it was enough. The snow kept falling, and I couldn't leave. The blizzard raged for another 2 days, trapping me in her cabin. I felt useless, a man reduced to feeding her fire and reading her journals. But she was the one who was in control. She told me where the food was, she told me how to cook it the way Samuel had liked it. She was the captain of her little ship, and I was just a passenger. She had survived the winter so far. She had survived her husband's death. She had survived the cold, the silence, and the doubt. She had survived everything that had been thrown at her, and she was just getting started. The storm broke on the 3rd day. The silence was replaced by a sound that was almost louder, the drip, drip, drip of melting snow, the creak of branches bending under their new weight, and the occasional crackle of the fire in the hearth. I felt a profound sense of relief, of release, as if the world had exhaled. I could leave. I could go back to my own life, my own problems, and forget the strange, haunting episode of the widow in the cabin. But I didn't leave, not then. Clara was sitting up in her chair, a heap of quilts around her like a cocoon. She looked smaller than before, fragile as a sparrow in the snow, but the clarity in her eyes was sharper. She was assessing me just as I was assessing her. I got the feeling she was cataloging me, filing me away in some mental cabinet next to the memory of her husband. "You ever sleep on a frozen floor before, Mr. Granger?" she asked, a faint, wry smile on her lips. It was the first hint of humor I'd seen from her, and it was like a crack in a dam. A flood of personality was about to break through. "Can't say I have," I admitted, rubbing my sore back. "I'm not built for it." "You're built for comfort, not for endurance," she said. "Most men are." It was a statement of fact, not an insult. My Samuel, he was built for endurance. He could stand in the middle of a blizzard and not feel it. He was a man who had the cold in his bones, but the fire in his heart. I watched her, fascinated. She wasn't just talking about her husband. She was defining the very principles by which she was trying to live. She was trying to become a woman of endurance, a woman of fire. The woodpile was low again, and the cold was creeping back in. The crisis of the last few days had passed, but the siege was far from over. "I'm going to have to go back to my place," I said, the words leaving my mouth with a sour taste. "I need to check my own stock. I have a responsibility, too." She nodded, a simple, accepting gesture. "I know, the world doesn't stop for a widow. It doesn't stop for anyone. You do what you have to do." She was giving me permission to leave, which made it harder to do so. I stood up, gathering my coat and hat. I was about to walk out the door, to return to my life of relative comfort and solitude, when she spoke again. "But I would be grateful if you could stay just a little longer," she said. "I need to get some wood chopped. I can't do it alone, not with my back. I'd pay you, of course. I have some money, it's not much." I cut her off. "No money," I said, my voice firmer than I intended. "I'll stay. I'll get your wood sorted. It's the least I can do." It was the least I could do. It was a pittance. I had just been a part of her survival story, a footnote in a chapter she was writing all by herself. Chopping her wood felt like the most insignificant of tasks, but it was also the most important. It was a lifeline. I spent the next 2 days working, an endless cycle of chopping, stacking, and hauling. The snow was deep, and the ground was frozen solid. Every swing of the axe jarred my shoulders and sent a shock of pain up my arms. I was a rancher, not a lumberjack, but I was determined to do this for her. My back ached, my hands blistered, and my face was chapped by the wind, but every time I thought about quitting, I'd catch a glimpse of her through the cabin window. She'd be sitting by the fire, reading Samuel's journal, her lips moving silently, whispering the words to herself as if they were a sacred text. When I finished, I came inside, my breath ragged, my body aching. She had made a pot of soup from a rabbit she'd managed to trap. It was thin and watery, but it was hot, and it was the best thing I'd ever tasted. "You're a good man, Luke," she said, using my first name for the first time. "But you're soft, you don't know how to suffer." I was taken aback. No one had ever called me soft before. I was a rancher, a man who lived a hard life and dealt with harsh realities, but she was right. I had never known the kind of suffering she was enduring. I had never stared death in the face and refused to blink. I had always had an escape route, a way out. "How do you do it?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. "How do you not break?" She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes searching mine. "Because breaking is a choice," she said. "You have to give in to it. You have to let the sorrow take you. I don't let it. I didn't let it when I found Sam's body. I didn't let it when the men came and told me to leave. I don't let it when I'm sitting here in the dark, cold, and alone. I just think of something else. I think of the spring, I think of the garden, I think of the color of Sam's eyes. I go somewhere else in my mind. She tapped her temple. That's where the real battle is. Not in the cold, not in the dark, not in the hunger. It's right up here. And I'm not going to lose a battle in my own head. I won't give them that satisfaction. Them, the world, I supposed, the people who had told her she couldn't do it. The doubters, the well-meaning fools who had tried to shepherd her away from her home. The snow came again, and this time I couldn't bring myself to leave. I stayed. I cut more wood. I patched a leak in the roof. I helped her dig out her chicken coop from a drift that was taller than me. I was becoming part of her world, but I was still an outsider. She was the general, and I was just a foot soldier. One afternoon, she asked me to teach her how to shoot a rifle. She'd found Samuel's old Winchester in the back of the closet. It was a heavy old weapon, but it was well maintained. It was a testament to the man's character. I need to be able to protect myself, she said, her voice determined. From the animals, and from the things that might come. She didn't elaborate on what those things might be. The apsh, the mountain madness, or perhaps the men who sometimes came up from the valley looking for trouble. The world could be a cruel place, even to a determined widow. We went out into the clearing. The snow was crisp under our boots, and the air was so cold it felt like it was cutting my throat. I showed her how to hold the rifle, how to aim, how to breathe. She was a natural. Her hands were steady, her eyes focused. She hit the target, an old tin can, on her third try. A triumphant smile spread across her face, a flash of pure, unadulterated joy. It was the first time I'd seen her truly happy. He used to talk about going hunting, she said, her voice soft. He'd detail me all about the deer he'd see, the elk, the bear. He never brought anything home, though. He said he couldn't bear to kill them. He just liked to watch them. He was a man of the heart, not of the stomach. And yet here she was, learning to kill. She was adapting, changing, becoming the person she needed to be to survive. She was not just enduring, she was becoming a new creature, forged by necessity. The weeks passed. We fell into a strange routine. I'd go back to my ranch for a few days to check on things and bring back supplies, flour, coffee, ammunition, and then I'd return to her cabin. I never asked if I could stay. She never asked me to stay. It was an unspoken understanding. I was there and I was staying. One night in the middle of January, we were sitting by the fire. The silence was comfortable, a shared space that wasn't demanding anything from either of us. She was darning a sock, her fingers moving with a practiced efficiency that was mesmerizing to watch. I was whittling a piece of pine, trying to carve a bird, a poor imitation of Samuel's chickadee. "You never told me what you believe," she said, breaking the silence. Her question was direct, simple, and deeply personal. It wasn't an accusation, it was an invitation. "Believe," I asked, fumbling the piece of wood. "Believe in what?" "In anything," she said. "In God, in the world, in people." She looked up from her sock, her eyes holding mine. "I believe in the soil," she said. "I believe in the seeds, I believe in the sun. I believe that if you plant something, it will grow if you give it enough time and care. I believe that's what life is about, planting things, nurturing things. And watching them grow." She paused, her gaze soft. "I think that's what Sam and I were trying to do here. We were trying to grow a life, and even though he's gone, I can't stop planting. I can't stop trying." I didn't have an answer for her. I had never thought about it that way. My belief system was a simple one: work hard, stay out of trouble, and try to make it through the day. I had never thought about planting things, about nurturing life. I had just been surviving. It was a profound, humbling realization. "I don't know what I believe," I admitted. "I think I've just been trying to get by." "That's a good start," she said. "Most people don't even do that. They just exist. They move through the world without really touching it. You, at least, are trying to get by. That's something." That night, as I lay on my pallet by the fire, I stared up at the ceiling, the rough-hewn beams a pattern of shadows and light. Her words were rattling around in my head. I had come here to rescue her, to save her from the winter and from herself. But I realized in that moment that she was the one who had saved me. She had given me a purpose, a reason to feel useful. She had shown me that survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about staying human. The next morning, she set me a new task. She took out a stack of Samuel's papers, drawings, and maps. "These are his plans for the garden," she said. "He wanted to build a greenhouse. He said it would let us grow vegetables all year round. He never got to build it." She looked at me, her eyes glittering with a dangerous mixture of grief and ambition. "But I'm going to build it, and I need your help." It was a monumental task. It would take weeks, maybe months. It would require supplies, lumber, glass, and a lot of heavy lifting. It was the project of a man with a dream, not a woman trying to survive a brutal winter. I hesitated. It was a fool's errand, an exercise in futility. Spring was still months away. The ground was still frozen. The world was still trying to kill her. "Clara," I said, trying to be gentle, "maybe we should wait until the spring, when the ground is soft, when the weather is better." She shook her head, a determined set to her jaw. "No," she said. "We start now. We can dig the foundation in the snow. We can drag the materials from the woodlot. We can work in the barn if we have to. It doesn't matter if the ground is frozen. We have to build it, Luke. If we don't, I'll lose my mind. I'll be sitting here in the cold, in the dark, thinking of all the things he wanted to do. I'll lose my mind." It wasn't about the greenhouse. It was about her sanity. It was about keeping her occupied, keeping her mind off the devastating loneliness that was waiting to creep in. It was about honoring her husband's memory, keeping his dreams alive by building them with her own hands. So we started. We worked for hours in the bitter cold. We used picks and shovels to break through the frozen ground, a slow, agonizing process. We dragged heavy wooden beams from the woodlot, straining our backs and our muscles. The work was brutal, almost absurd. It felt like the world was against us, like the frozen earth itself was trying to resist our efforts. But she was relentless. She was a machine driven by an engine of grief and defiance. One afternoon, a particularly heavy beam slipped and she stumbled, falling into the snow. I rushed over, my heart in my throat. "Clara, are you okay? Are you hurt?" She was on her hands and knees, a look of pure frustration on her face. And then she started to laugh. It was a great, heaving, uncontrollable laugh that echoed through the silent forest. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated absurdity. "Look at us," she gasped between laughs. "We're building a greenhouse on top of a glacier. Sam is probably rolling in his grave. He was always so practical, he'd probably tell us we were mad." I couldn't help it. I started to laugh too. It was the absurdity of it all, the sheer, stubborn foolishness of our endeavor. Two fools building a dream on a frozen mountainside. We laughed until our bellies ached and tears ran down our cheeks, the tears freezing on our faces. It was in that moment that I truly understood her. Her stubbornness wasn't just a survival mechanism. It was her own personal form of joy. She was fighting, yes, but she was also living. She was refusing to let the world defeat her spirit. She was building a monument to her love, not out of stone or marble, but out of frozen wood and dreams. That, I realized, was the most beautiful kind of love I had ever seen. The work continued. Slowly, painstakingly, the foundation of the greenhouse took shape. It was a testament to our persistence. It was a miracle carved out of the frozen earth. And in the process, she was no longer just a widow. She was a creator. She was a builder. She was a woman who was determined to see the future, even when the present seemed to be nothing but a long, cold night. The last day of February was a slow surrender. The sun, for the first time in what felt like eons, had a hint of warmth to it. Not enough to melt the snow, but enough to promise that it would, eventually. The world was beginning to change, to groan and stretch and prepare for its annual rebirth. The greenhouse was a skeletal frame, a monument of rough-hewn wood and stubborn ambition. The construction had slowed in the last few weeks. The cold had been relentless, our bodies worn down by the constant labor. But we had done the impossible. We had started. The foundation was in the ground. The bones of the structure stood against the mountain sky. It was a testament to our madness, our sheer, pig-headed refusal to accept defeat. I was sitting on the porch of the cabin, looking out at the skeleton of the greenhouse. The snow was melting in patches, revealing the dark, wet earth beneath. It was a beautiful sight, a harbinger of the life that was about to come. Clara was inside, I thought. I hadn't seen her all morning. My pocket watch was in my hand, the worn, smooth metal of familiar comfort. "Luke." Her voice was a high, thin shriek, not a cry of fear, but a cry of urgency. I was on my feet in an instant, my heart hammering. I rushed into the cabin, my mind racing through a dozen terrifying scenarios. She had fallen. The stove had caught fire. The roof had caved in. But when I burst through the door, I found her standing in the middle of the room, her face pale, her hands trembling. She was holding a letter. It was on a thick, heavy paper, the kind that only came from the bank in town. "What is it?" I asked, my voice rough. "It's from the bank," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They're going to take the land. Samuel had a mortgage. He hadn't paid it off." She sank into the rocking chair, the letter falling from her limp fingers. I thought it was paid for. I thought it was ours. He never told me." The words hung in the air, heavy and brutal. The land, the cabin, the garden, the greenhouse, everything she had fought for, everything she had sacrificed, everything she had endured, it was all built on a foundation of sand. The bank, a faceless entity in the valley, was about to take it all away. I picked up the letter and read it. It was a formal legal document stating that the property was in arrears and would be auctioned off in the spring. The date was in a month to find a way to pay off a debt that was clearly beyond her means. "Clara," I said, my voice gentle, "I can help you. I can give you the money." She looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed but still fierce. "No," she said, her voice sharp. "I won't take your money. That's not what this is about." "What is it about then?" I asked, my voice rising in frustration. "It's a piece of land. It's a few acres of dirt and rock. You've proved you can survive here, Clara, but you can survive anywhere. You don't have to stay here. You can come with me. I'll take care of you." "I don't want to be taken care of," she shouted, standing up from her chair. "I don't want to be saved. I want to be the one who saves something for once." Her voice cracked and she turned away from me, her shoulders shaking. "I wanted to save this place. I wanted to save his dream. I wanted to prove to him, to myself, to everyone that it mattered, that we mattered." She was a woman on the edge of a cliff, staring into an abyss of grief and defeat. The winter had been a battle she had been winning, but this was a war she was losing. The enemy wasn't the cold or the snow or the dark. It was the world. It was a system that didn't care about her dreams or her sacrifices. It was the cruel, indifferent machinery of economics. And I had no answer for her. I couldn't fight the bank. I couldn't argue with the law. I could only offer her a lifeline, a way out, but she wouldn't take it. She was too proud, too stubborn, too broken. The next 2 weeks were a torment. The greenhouse stood, half-finished, a symbol of a dream that had been strangled before it could be born. Clara was a ghost in the cabin. She moved about her daily tasks, chopping wood, feeding the chickens, cooking her meager meals, but she was hollow. The light had gone out of her eyes. The fire in her heart had been extinguished. I tried everything. I brought her books from my ranch. I played my harmonica for her. I talked to her about the spring, about the garden, about the things we would do. But she would just nod, a distant, faraway look in her eyes. She was retreating into herself, a place I couldn't follow. "I'm going to go see the banker," I told her one morning. "I'm going to talk to him. I'm going to work something out." She looked at me, her eyes empty. "It won't matter. They don't care about us. We're just names in a ledger. They don't care about the greenhouse. They don't care about Sam. They only care about the money." I went anyway. The ride to the valley was long and silent. The world was waking up, the snow retreating, the birds returning. It was a world of new beginnings, but I felt nothing but a deep, gnawing despair. I met with the banker, a thin weasel of a man named Mr. Higgins. I pleaded with him, told him the story of Clara's winter, her struggle, her resilience. I told him about Samuel, about the dream, about the greenhouse. I even offered to pay the debt myself on a long-term loan. He listened, his face impassive. When I finished, he shook his head. "It's a matter of policy, Mr. Granger," he said. "The mortgage is in arrears, the property will be auctioned. That's the law, I'm sorry." It was a polite, professional dismissal. I was a rancher, a nobody, and I was trying to argue with the system. I was like a fly buzzing against a window pane. I had failed her. I had failed the woman who had taught me about endurance, about resilience, about the power of the human spirit. I went back to the cabin, my head hanging. I didn't know what I was going to tell her. I was a failure. I had come here to save her and ended up just another disappointment. When I arrived, I didn't see her. The cabin was dark. The fire was out. I went inside, a cold dread settling in my stomach. I found her in the garden, kneeling in the wet, thawing soil. She was wearing her frayed shawl, and she was digging in the dirt with her bare hands. The soil was cold and muddy, but she didn't seem to notice. "The auction is still on, Clara," I said, my voice thick. "I'm sorry." She didn't look up from her work, she just kept digging. "I know," she said, her voice calm. "He told me all about it." My heart lurched. "Who told you?" "The banker," she said. "He came here himself." She looked up at me then, and I saw a strange, unfamiliar light in her eyes. It wasn't grief. It wasn't anger. It was triumph. "He offered me a deal," she said. "He said I could keep the land if I paid the back taxes and a small fee. He wanted me to sign a waiver." "What kind of waiver?" I asked, my heart pounding. "A waiver that would give him the right to hunt on my land," she said. "To develop some parts of it. 2, her voice trailed off, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. She stood up holding a small, wet object in her hands. But I had other plans. She held out her hands, and in them, cradled like a sacred treasure, was a small, green shoot, pushing its way up through the cold, dark earth. It was a single leaf, tiny and fragile, but it was alive. It was new life breaking through the crust of the old world. "I found it this morning," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "It's a shoot from the rhubarb Sam planted 20 years ago. It's still here, it's still alive. It's the first sign of spring, it's the first sign of life." She looked at me, her eyes shining with a fierce light. "I told the banker to go to hell," she said. "I told him he could take the land, he could take the cabin, he could take everything, but he couldn't take this. He couldn't take the life that Sam put into this soil. He couldn't take the memory of this place. And he couldn't take my hope. He took it all away, but he missed one thing." She held up the tiny shoot. "He missed the beginning." And then she laughed. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated joy, a sound so powerful it seemed to shake the walls of the cabin. It was the sound of a woman who had been through hell and had emerged on the other side, battered, bruised, but unbroken. It was the sound of a woman who had realized that she was no longer just a widow, but the guardian of a legacy, a keeper of a dream. The greenhouse, I knew, would never be finished. The land would be taken by the bank. She would have to leave. The winter would end and her world would change, but it didn't matter. In her hands, she held a single green leaf. It was the symbol of everything she had been fighting for. It was the proof that the world was still alive, that life persisted, that hope was a stubborn, resilient thing that could not be killed. She didn't need the land, she didn't need the cabin. She had the memory, she had the spirit, and she had the beginning. The last snow melted from the roof of the cabin, and the world was a little more green and a little less white. The hummingbirds returned to the feeders she'd kept for them. I finally left for good, knowing I had work to do at my own ranch. I never saw her again, at least not for a long time. She left, as she was always going to, but she left on her own terms. The last image I have of her is standing in the garden, the tiny green shoot held in her hand, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of gratitude. She had stayed. She had survived. And in doing so, she had proven that some things are worth fighting for, even when the whole world tells you it's hopeless. That little shoot was a symbol of a promise she had kept to herself, a promise of a future she was determined to build, no matter how small. And as I turned my horse away, I knew that in some way I had been changed by her. I had seen the strength of her endurance, the power of her love, and the resilience of a human spirit that simply refused to break. I rode back to my lonely ranch, carrying the ghost of that single green leaf in my heart.